There are 5 specific scientists throughout history who perfectly embody 5 of the 7 deadly sins. But if we flip these upside down, we'll find another 5 who represent the exact opposite, 5 of the 7 heavenly virtues. And today we're comparing why exactly each of these geniuses represents their sin or their virtue. So let's start with wrath versus patience, and the most famous feud in the history of science, Thomas Edison versus Nikola Tesla. Wrath is a strong feeling of hatred and resentment with a burning desire for vengeance, and no one in science embodies it better than Thomas Edison. Now, most people know Edison as the friendly genius who gave us the light bulb, but what they don't teach you in school is that he was willing to destroy anyone who threatened his money. Because in the 1880s, Edison's entire fortune was built on one type of electricity, called DC power. Then, his former employee, a quiet genius named Nikola Tesla, invented a better type, called AC power, and it was cheaper, it traveled further, and it was simply superior. So instead of admitting Tesla's was better, Edison declared war on him. And this is where it gets dark, because to convince the public that Tesla's electricity was deadly, Edison held public events where he electrocuted animals on stage, just to make people associate AC power with death. He even helped promote the electric chair using Tesla's AC power, specifically so the public would connect his rival's invention to execution. One of the most celebrated inventors in history used his fame and his fortune not to build something new, but to terrify the public and bury a better man's work, and that is wrath. But the man on the other side of that war never fought back with cruelty, he just kept working, and that brings us to patience. Patience is the ability to keep going despite setbacks and suffering, and Nikola Tesla is the greatest example of it in all of science. Because while Edison was electrocuting animals to smear him, Tesla was quietly building the modern world and getting almost nothing for it. In fact, the electricity running through the wall behind you right now is Tesla's AC power, and he also laid the groundwork for radio, remote controls, and wireless technology, decades before anyone else was ready for it. But here's how the world repaid him. He died completely alone and broke in a small New York hotel room, buried in debt, feeding pigeons for company. So the man who lit up the entire planet couldn't even afford his own rent. And yet, even as he watched lesser men steal his ideas and get rich, he never became bitter. He just kept inventing until the very end. So Edison won the money, but Tesla won history. And that brings us to a man who traded his legacy for his own ego, which is the sin of pride. Pride is an excessive love of your own greatness, and no one embodies it like Fritz Haber. A name most people have never heard, but absolutely should, because he might be the most morally confusing man who ever lived. So let's start with the good, because Haber figured out how to pull nitrogen out of thin air and turn it into fertilizer. And that one discovery feeds roughly half the people alive on Earth today. In simple terms, without Fritz Haber, billions of people would starve, which makes him one of the greatest lifesavers in human history. But then his pride took over. Because when World War I began, Haber wanted to be a hero for Germany so badly that he turned his own chemistry into a weapon, inventing and personally directing the first large-scale poison gas attack in history, standing right there at the front lines to give the order himself. Then he came home and threw a party to celebrate. But that same night, his wife Clara, who was a brilliant chemist herself and was horrified by what he had done, took his pistol and killed herself in their garden. And Haber's response? He left for the front the very next morning to go gas more soldiers, and he didn't even stay for her funeral. He won the Nobel Prize just months later, and his pride convinced him he was a hero right up until the day he died. But now compare that to the single most famous scientist who ever lived, a man who had every reason to be arrogant and chose the exact opposite: humility. Humility is staying modest no matter how great you become, and Albert Einstein is the perfect example, because Einstein's name is literally the world's word for genius. So if anyone ever earned the right right to brag, it was him, and yet he stayed painfully humble. In fact, he brushed off his own genius all the time, once saying he had no special talent and was only passionately curious. But his humility ran much deeper than a few modest words, because in 1939, terrified that the Nazis would build an atomic bomb first, Einstein signed a letter urging America to build one before them, and that letter helped start the Manhattan Project. When America dropped those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein was devastated, and he called signing that letter the one great mistake of his life. So unlike Haber, who stayed proud of his weapon until his dying breath, Einstein spent the rest of his life fighting against nuclear weapons, using his fame not to celebrate himself, but to protect the world from what science had unleashed. Because pride says, look what I made, but humility says, look what I've done and how do I fix it? And that brings us from a man who gave everything away to a sin all about keeping everything: greed. Greed is a selfish hunger for more, usually money, and it made one scientist willing to poison the entire planet for a paycheck: Thomas Midgley Jr. Because a historian once said Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history, and that was not a compliment. So car engines used to knock and rattle, and Midgley's solution was to add lead to gasoline, and it worked, but it also pumped poisonous lead into the air of every city for over 50 years, harming millions of people and lowering the IQ of an entire generation of children. And here's the greed. Because Midgley knew the lead was toxic, and so did his company, and there was even a safer option, but that safer option couldn't be patented, so there was no money in it, and they chose the poison simply because the poison paid. In fact, to prove it was safe, Midgley washed his hands in leaded gasoline in front of reporters while he was secretly recovering from lead poisoning himself. And then he did it again, inventing CFCs, the chemicals that tore a giant hole in the ozone layer, which is the shield that stops the sun from cooking us alive. So that's two inventions and two global disasters from one man, both for profit. But now here's a man who held a check worth $7 billion and tore it up, which is charity. Charity is helping others and improving the world, no matter the cost to yourself. And Jonas Salk lived it completely. Because in the 1950s, polio was the monster every parent feared, sweeping through cities every summer, paralyzing and killing thousands of children. And no one knew who would be next.
This is a full-grown man after polio. These are his legs, his knees, his hips, his hands. He can move his fingers a little, he can move his head, and that's all. The rest of him is a powerless shell.
But then Salk created the vaccine that stopped it, and when it was announced safe in 1955, strangers cried in the streets, and church bells rang across the whole country because he had killed the monster. And then he did the most heavenly thing on this entire list, because a reporter asked him who owned the patent to the vaccine, a patent worth an estimated $7 billion, and Salk simply said, well, the people, I would say. Could you patent the sun? So he gave it away for free, just so it could reach every child on Earth as fast as possible. Because where Midgley chose poison because it paid, Salk walked away from billions of dollars simply because saving children mattered more to him than getting rich, and that is the definition of charity. But now, from selfless giving to the ugliest sin of all, envy. And this one might make you angry, because it's about a man you were taught to worship. Envy is a bitter jealousy of someone else's success, so deep that you'd rather destroy your rival than share the credit. And, as shocking as it sounds, that describes Isaac Newton. Because yes, Newton gave us gravity, calculus, and the laws of motion, which arguably makes him the most important scientist ever, but he was also incredibly vindictive. So let me explain. Because Newton didn't just want to win, he wanted his rivals erased. So take Robert Hooke, a brilliant scientist who dared to challenge Newton's ideas. After Hooke died, Newton, who was now the most powerful man in British science, made sure Hooke's reputation was destroyed. And here's the chilling part. There is no confirmed portrait of Robert Hooke that survives today, and many historians blame Newton's grudge for that. Then there was Leibniz, a man who invented calculus completely on his own, at the same time as Newton. But instead of sharing the credit, Newton used his power as head of the Royal Society to run a fake investigation, one that he secretly wrote the conclusion to himself, all to destroy Leibniz and claim calculus for his own name. So Leibniz died disgraced and broke, and Newton reportedly said it gave him great satisfaction to have broken his heart. So yes, Newton was a genius, but his envy was so deep he'd rather ruin a man than share a single line of the credit. And that's the exact opposite of a woman who was robbed of her own credit and never became bitter. kindness. Kindness is being selfless and compassionate toward others, and Marie Curie lived it, even though she had every reason not to. Because she worked in a time that tried everything to keep women out of science, and she was almost denied her own Nobel Prize just because she was a woman, since the committee first tried to give it only to her husband. And yet she was endlessly kind, because she discovered 2 brand new elements, won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, the first person in history to ever do that, and instead of keeping her discovery to herself, she gave it to the world. In fact, she refused to patent her radium process, even though it would have made her one of the richest people alive, purely so that doctors and scientists everywhere could use it for free to help people, which is the same choice Salk made decades later. And during World War I, she personally drove X-ray machines to the front lines to help wounded soldiers, in the mud, by hand, saving lives directly. But it cost her everything, because the radiation she handled so kindly and so freely is exactly what killed her, and her notebooks are still so radioactive today that they're kept in lead-lined boxes. So she gave away her knowledge, then her fortune, and finally her life, all to help others, and that is kindness that literally glows. But now we've reached the final sin, the one that held back all of human progress for over 1,000 years: sloth. Sloth is the failure to act. A laziness so deep it wastes the gift you were given. And strangely, the deadliest case in history came from one man's authority: Aristotle. Aristotle was a real genius, one of the founders of Western thought. So how is he guilty of sloth? Well, it wasn't his own laziness. It was the laziness he accidentally created in everyone who came after him. Because Aristotle declared all kinds of things to be fact using only his logic, without ever testing them. So he claimed heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, and he was wrong. And he made confident claims about the body and the universe that were also wrong. And that part is forgivable, because he lived in a time before experiments existed. But here's the sloth, because for over 1,000 years after his death, scholars were so in awe of Aristotle that they simply believed him without question. In other words, nobody bothered to test his claims, and Aristotle said so was treated as final proof. So science basically fell asleep, coasting on one man's word instead of checking reality for itself. And it took until the 1600s, when people like Galileo finally dropped the weights and tested it, for the world to wake back up. So one man's authority became everyone else's excuse to stop working. And that is the deadliest sloth imaginable, which is the complete opposite of a man who worked for over 20 years before he dared to publish a single word: diligence. Diligence is working hard and relentlessly toward your goal, no matter how long it takes. And Charles Darwin is the ultimate example, because Darwin had the biggest idea in the history of biology: evolution by natural selection. And yet he sat on it for more than 20 years because he refused to publish until he had proven everything. So where Aristotle guessed and let the world coast, Darwin did the opposite and checked everything obsessively. In fact, he spent 8 full years just studying barnacles, tiny, boring little sea creatures, purely to make sure he understood how life varies in nature before making his bigger claims. And he filled notebook after notebook, ran experiments in his own garden, and wrote thousands of letters, testing his own theory harder than any critic ever could. So when he finally published On the Origin of Species in 1859, it was so carefully proven that it reshaped all of biology, and it still stands as the foundation of life science today. Because that's the reward of diligence. Not a lucky guess, but a truth so solid it lasts forever. So while Aristotle let the world sleep for 1,000 years, Darwin did the work that finally woke it up for good. So there they are, 5 who gave in to their worst instincts, and 5 who rose above them. But here's the real gut punch, because look how close every one of these pairs actually is. Haber and Einstein both helped build weapons of mass destruction, but one died proud of it, while the other spent his whole life in regret. Now I want your verdict. Was I too harsh on Newton? Is envy really a sin if you're that brilliant? And is Aristotle actually guilty? Or did I go too far? Drop your rankings in the comments, because I read every one, and the best takes will make it into